called very simply COVID-19, a primer on the pandemic and politics. And we're very honored to have our two speakers, one of which, Marshall Dinowitz, is also the vice chair of our club. And Marshall is retired from Genentech, where he was responsible for various aspects of viral safety and biotechnology production. He has a Doctor of Science in pathobiology and virology from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And he was on the faculty of the Arizona Medical Center, where he taught virology and medical and molecular microbiology. Now, our other speaker is Tony Holzman. He is Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics, Public Health, and Epidemiology, also at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. He's an MD. Tony lives in Menlo Park, and since retiring, he has published 5 novels and has a book, The Strange Malady of Alessandro's Uncle, and other stories, which will be published this summer. So Marshall is going to start. And Marshall, will you let us know, do you want people to ask questions during your presentation, or do you want them to wait until after?
Well, if there's too many questions while I'm speaking, we'll run over. If there's great confusion, I'll try to answer it. Otherwise, I'll say, can you wait until I finish? And we'll address it at the end, if that's all right.
All right. So Marshall, you're up.
Okay. So now the next challenge is to make sure I can get my screen up. For some reason, it's not coming up. Diana, is there something on your end that you need to do? You disabled the attendee screen sharing. Diana, can you hear me? Oh, Diana, you're muted. Diana, can you hear me?
I can hear him.
Yes, I can hear you. And let me see if I can. When I set this up, it was to share the screen. So.
Yeah, I'm getting a message saying disabled attendee screen share.
Okay.
Yeah.
Everybody.
You didn't send it to me.
Send to everybody.
Okay. Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
All right. Okay, try it. It still says host disabled attendee screen sharing. Ugh.
Oh. Elsa Sami.
Well, in the meanwhile, I promise not to sing a song.
Thank you for that.
When does it start?
Now.
Now? Oh.
Okay, so I'm going to pull up your presentation if that's okay.
I hope it has the latest. I think it, don't put that one up. That's better, okay. And can you do the full screen slideshow? Go to slideshow, yeah, up here. Okay. When we talked about this before we set it up, I was asked if I could give a quick primer on a virus and COVID-19, and then give some more information about some of the parameters of an epidemic, and then Tony's going to follow with more of that. So next slide, please. Okay, so what I'm going to cover is a quick primer on the virus, a little bit about the infection and what it actually does and why it's so nasty, and about the spread in the population, how that happens, and a bit about the epidemiology that has been such a major discussion on everywhere. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just a terminology. Okay, this particular virus is called a coronavirus. The official viral name is SARS-CoV-2, but the disease is called COVID-19. And that's the main terminology that most people hear, COVID, okay? So I'm just going to refer to it as COVID, as both the disease and the virus, because people are very used to that. Next slide. So I've gotten questions, so I'm going to start very basic. Viruses are biological entities. They're not a molecule. They're an actual biological entity. And there are many different kinds of viruses. You've heard of a number of them, of course. You've heard of the flu virus, various cold viruses, polio, herpes, influenza. They're all very different. Each of those viruses that I mentioned are very different from each other. And if you think about it, viruses, the various virus groups like coronavirus or polio or influenza, they're as different from each other as other kinds of species that we're familiar with. For example, birds. You know, hummingbirds are not penguins, and poliovirus is not coronavirus or influenza. They're very different. So that's one of the first things, you know, because everybody always says, I have the flu. Well, having the flu means you had the influenza virus, but many colds are not influenza viruses. There's different kinds. So just a little background about that. So if I get a next slide, please. Next slide. Diana. Uh-oh. Diana, can I have the next slide? Diana, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but it is not letting me advance the slides.
I see. Can you see if you can get me back to control it?
Oh, is that the next slide?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. It was a different key that I was using. Okay. Oh my gosh.
The key to it is to use the right key. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So viruses have genes in them, just like many other, like all the other organisms that we're familiar with, plants, animals, whatever. And some of them have DNA genes, some have RNA genes. Coronaviruses are RNA genes. Okay, so that's just one little point to take away. Next slide. Okay, viruses are extremely small. They're what is referred, some of you know this kind of stuff, but not everybody. They're very small. They're like 100 to 200 nanometers. Now, most people listening probably aren't familiar with what a nanometer is, but to give you a sense of it, a nanometer is 1/10,000th of a millimeter. And you know, viruses are very small. And that's important to know when we get to a little bit about masks and stuff like that. So, whoops, okay. So, can you go back one? Diana? Okay, no, back one, not forward. One more back. One more back.
Okay, turn it off. Yeah, turn it off.
So, these very small entities, these viruses, they're basically a tiny sphere of protein inside of which are the genes. And, you know, COVID has RNA genes. Next slide. Next slide, please. Somebody said they're not unmuted. We got a lot of background. Okay, so just to give you a notion, this is blown up 50 million times roughly. I don't know how big, but this is what a virus looks like structure. And you can see around the side of it are these purple spikes that make crown-like look, and that's why they're called coronaviruses, because corona means crown. And so when they were first seen in an electron microscope, they had this crown view around it, these little spikes, these purple lollipops. And then right beneath those spikes is a protein sphere. Now this is a cutout. This is cut through the sphere. So you can't see the whole sphere because we cut through it to see what was inside. And you'll see inside is this looping wire with little red things. Dear, you're going in the wrong direction. Back one more, please. One more. Okay, so this yellow wire that has these red things attached to it, the yellow wire is the RNA genes. So this is a schematic of how this whole thing is set up. So so these little things are a 10,000th of a millimeter each. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so how do viruses work? They have to get inside of a cell before they can grow. They aren't like plants or other things that will grow if they're outside in the right kind of environment, like earth or some dirt or something. They have to get into a cell, and they have to get into the kind of cell that recognizes, and that the virus recognizes that this cell is going to let it in. And once it gets into the cell, the RNA genes become accessible, and those genes take over the cell production machinery and tells it to make more viruses instead of what it usually does. And so all viruses are required to be intracellular.
People, sorry, Marshall, people need to mute. Nancy, you need to mute. Whoever the person is under you needs to mute. A bunch of people are still not muted, so please mute.
And Diana, you got to move forward one. Okay, so each infected cell can make hundreds or thousands of viruses. And these new viruses can then get out of the cell and infect other cells in the body. And these new viruses that are released can be released from the infected person and infect other people. So that's basically the life cycle of how it works. And as I said, each cell can make hundreds or thousands of viruses. So the next slide is a picture through an electron microscope. And in the middle, that thing that looks a little bit like a football is the cell that was infected by a virus. And all these little guys were released by that cell. And you can see how many each cell can make. So what you have is a huge number of viruses coming out. Next slide, please. Okay, so what happens when the virus gets inside and gets into this person? It can infect cells in the respiratory system, for example, lungs, and eventually when it makes more virus, it can spread to other cells and organs. Next slide, please. This gruesome looking slide just shows that the virus can go to all these different places. It can, after it gets initial infection, it can go into the lungs, the heart and blood vessels, the brain, eyes, nose, liver, kidney, intestine, and so on. And that's why it's such a nasty virus. Many of the viruses that we get don't necessarily have the range of organs like this that can infect. And one of the more important things that's recently come out is, you'll notice under 2, heart and blood vessels, is that there's a lot of blood clotting. And that is part of the danger of this virus, because once you start getting a lot of blood clotting, all kinds of bad things happen. You clog up blood vessels and so on. Next slide, please.
Marshall, please excuse me. For those who are on your phone, you can use *6 to mute and unmute yourself. Please mute yourself by using *6. Thank you. Thank you, Marshall.
Okay, so when the virus gets in, it damages the cells and organs as the virus grows. And whenever you get infected by anything, what the body does is it recognizes, in this case, the virus as something that doesn't belong in you, and it activates its immune system. And one of the things that it activates is what's called inflammation, that we're all familiar with. You know, like if you get a little infection on your hand or finger or something, it gets all red, that's inflammation. And what happens is your white blood cells gravitate to that area, and they're trying to fight the virus. And when you get a lot of white blood cells in one place, they start releasing chemicals that bring more white blood cells and also cause fevers and cause all kinds of responses by the body to fight the virus and any other disease. The problem in the COVID virus infection, in this particular one, is that it causes huge inflammation, and it's too much in many cases. And too much isn't good, because then that's when you start seeing damage to these tissues actually by these white blood cells releasing a lot of these other chemicals. And as I said, it could also lead to blood clotting. Next slide. Okay, so now just a little bit about the spread which is a key issue in epidemics, obviously, or any viral or any other infection. The infected individual releases virus, and the release can, in this case, can be through breathing, through talking, through coughing, through sneezing. And what that means is that if you're close to somebody and they're infected, depending on how that virus is getting out, like any of these 4 points methods that I mentioned, there'll be more or less virus. If you cough and sneeze, you're releasing, you're throwing out more and further. Whereas breathing is more gentle, so you probably have to be closer to the person for a long time to get enough. But so breathing, so this is listed in sort of the order in which it gets worse and worse. You know, breathing is less, talking is a little more, coughing and sneezing. And then if you're near somebody or touch something that got contaminated with it, and the virus has not yet fallen apart by either drying out or too much heat or sunshine, something like that, then you can either breathe it in, or you can touch the surface and including your own hands and other parts of you that might have the virus on it. And when you touch your nose, your eyes, and your mouth, the virus might land on a cell that's able to be infected. Okay, so that's how the virus gets transmitted and how you get infected. Next. So what happens, you know, given the interruptions we have, I've lost track of how much time I've taken, but I only have a few more slides. So the dynamics of any epidemic and pandemic is based on a couple of things. The virus infects, obviously, uninfected individuals, and then some number of people that the infected person can contact will be infected. Oops, and what happens is something called exponential increase in the number of people that get infected. I'm going to spend a minute or two on that. But basically, if you have a doubling of the number of people that are infected, one person can infect 2 and 2 can infect 4. So in figuring out how we needed to deal with the epidemic, we needed to know how many people were infected, how many people they can infect, and how quickly that could go. Because we don't know whether the time to get 2 people infected is a day, several days, a week, several weeks. And that's figured out by epidemiological analysis. So if I could get the next slide, please.
Okay. Okay, go.
So Marshall, again, if I might interrupt, just a reminder to people who are on their phones, *6 to mute yourself, please mute. And later you can use *9 to put your hand up to ask a question. *6 to mute, please. Thank you.
Diana, she's only turning her screen off. She never mutes. Can you do it from your end? It's iPhone person. I've been watching her the whole time. She never mutes.
Well, I hate to disrupt. So every time I try to do something, I disrupt
No,
Marshall's.
why don't we just hope that it won't be. So if I can have the next slide, please. Okay, so what does exponential growth mean? And what are the implications for this epidemic we're in? And if I could have the next slide, it's incredibly important. Did we miss a slide?
Let me see.
Yes, okay. It's incredibly important in understanding how we did things right or wrong in this pandemic, in knowing about exponential growth. So what it means is, as you can see here, one person, if one person can infect 2 people and 2 can infect 2 more, you'll have 4 people. And if those 4 can infect 2 more each, then you'll have 8 infected, and so on as you go down this slide until you see the 10th set of doublings will, from one person starting, will be over 1,000. And so it increases quickly from just the initial person to 1,000. And if you have thousands of people infected, you can see how quickly, as it doubles, it can get to many, many hundreds of thousands. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is an example I took from somewhere on the internet that shows what happened in the early days when we didn't do things right. And Tony's going to talk more about this. But basically, you can see at February 15th, there were just very few cases. And then they slowly doubled until you got out to March and you were in the thousands. Next slide, please. And so when you look at the cases that happened in January, you know, when the first ones happened, those little blue dots at the bottom start moving up because more and more people are exponentially infecting other people. And if you move to the right where the blue dots cross that red line, you'll see the red line is when they first realized they were having community spread. Before that, when people were not symptomatic, that is, they didn't show anything, we didn't know this was going on, or some people didn't know. But epidemiologically, we know that this is the case. And so when you cross that red line to the right, you start going up and you see that orange period is exponential growth. And you went from 10 down at the bottom all the way up to hundreds of thousands at the top. You'll notice that this is not a linear scale. This is an exponential scale, tenfold. Each of those crosshatches is tenfold. So it goes from 10 to 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. And you can see how quickly it went up because that the red stripe down the middle, or toward the middle there, is at about day 33 or something. And you can see that by day something like 65, that those 10 got up to 100,000 just by exponential growth. That's how fast epidemics can move if we don't do something about it. Next slide. This is another version of that. Depending on how quickly it doubles, the blue diagonal line is what happens if the doubling is only 3 days. The red line is if the doubling is 6 days, and the yellow line is if it levels off. And you can see that we were in the blue line, the blue squares, for quite a while. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we talked about the discussion on the news and internet and so on was all about trying to flatten the curve. And what that actually means is this big purple curve is a description of what happens in an epidemic. And when the pandemic outbreaks, and you don't do anything about it, it rapidly, as you can see, goes up to a peak. And eventually it slows down because maybe there's no more people to infect or very few. And so then it goes down. If you try to flatten the curve by reducing the number of cases, by isolating infected people, identifying infected people, have people shelter at home, you can push that curve down. That's called flattening the curve. And so you can see at the lower right-hand side, it says pandemic outbreak with intervention. So you can see there's a huge difference between if you don't do anything and if you do something. You flatten the curve. What that means is a heck of a lot fewer people are infected and a heck of a lot fewer people die. Next slide, please. This is another way of looking at it, but the point is here, without the flattening, you have the left-hand curve. In the middle, you have flattening that allows the healthcare system to take care of it better. You remember we were overwhelming the emergency rooms, and so it was a real problem. But when you flatten the curve to get so that it's within the healthcare capacity, makes it much better, obviously. And that was due largely through social distancing and shelter at home. Next slide, please. So what could have been done, and I know Tony will go more into that, sheltering in quarantine because it's highly transmissible from person to person. We should have been testing sick people, not only sick people, because when you only test sick people, you don't know all the other people around. How do we get it? We don't even know what the percentage of people are getting sick and actually dying. So that gets into a little more of the politics of testing and the curve flattening and its long and short-term implications. So next slide, please. Okay, so because we didn't do that, that's why we got into so much pandemic trouble. In case you didn't think I'd mention the administration, they ignored science and the dynamics of epidemics, and you saw what happened. Pandemic guidance had been prepared for decades, but it was thrown out by the current administration, and they didn't follow good epidemiological practice, meaning to isolate, to test, to track people. And so now we're in a situation where we need to figure out how to best deal with the current epidemic situation. Obviously, people can't stay home forever. The stores and everything can't stay home forever. And Tony will be elaborating on this. May I have the next slide, please? And this is contact for both Tony and me, so that if you have questions after this, you hope to get some clarification, please, you can email either or both of us. And I hope this next slide is a blank, I hope. Yes, okay, so now I can, back one, please. So I'm happy to answer a few questions if the timing is okay. And then Tony will start.
So let me just again let people know that in under participants, you can raise your hand if you have a question for Marshall. And people on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand.
I know I went fast through a lot of fundamental stuff, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of how this all works.
So far, I do not see any hands up.
Okay, well, oh wait, Susie has her, you have to unmute, Susie.
Anyway, I know, and so does Rob. Rob has his hand up. So
Oh,
just
okay.
generally, I wanted to know the difference between the RNA and the DNA virus and what that means in the long run. The RNA can mutate, is that the difference?
No, it's just that different viruses have different sets of genes. Some viruses have RNA genes, and I mean, all coronaviruses have RNA genes, and all other viruses have, whatever that species has. So it turns out that influenza has RNA as well, but herpes their genes are DNA, and the mutation rate, the mutation is similar. But different viruses use different ways of getting mutations into the system. Influenza virus, for example, is designed for mutating like crazy. It mutates all the time. Coronavirus is probably very slow in mutating. It's, which
Hi.
means, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question, Greg.
Greg, do you know how to raise your hand on the computer screen?
It doesn't seem to work. I tried to do it, but it doesn't work.
Did you open the participants screen?
Yeah, I did, but it doesn't work.
So Greg, while I have Susie there, Susie, you're indicating that you can see people in chat. I can't access chat while I have the screen share open. Would
Okay.
you mind calling on people for me for in chat? That would be great.
Okay, sure.
And other people, please mute yourselves.
Yeah. So Elsa, you're still not muted. I don't know if you need to be unmuted. But so Greg, let's go, Rob go next because he's had his hand up, and then you're next.
Sure, thanks, Susie. Hi, Marshall, and great presentation. Question for you. I mean, there's been some talk that that coronaviruses and this virus in particular sometimes are very difficult to develop a vaccine for. So can you talk about what the possibility is that they won't be able to develop a vaccine, or what the factors would be involved that would perhaps prevent us from having an effective vaccine?
Well, I don't, I'm not sure that it would be difficult to develop a vaccine or not. We don't know yet, because there are a number of factors that have to be considered. One is we already know the genes of this virus, and so we already know how to make a vaccine, but we don't know a couple things. One, we don't know whether it will induce immunity in people. So you can create a potential vaccine for anything, but until you inject people with the vaccine and get a response from those people, you don't know whether it's going to protect them. Because it depends. See, vaccines are our body's response to very specific proteins in the virus. And we're not sure exactly which proteins will produce the antibodies that will cause immunity. The second problem is, even if you develop a vaccine that induces the antibodies against the antibodies, we're not sure whether it will protect. And there have been certain vaccines developed in the past that did get people to produce antibodies against them, but unfortunately, it made the infection worse when people got infected later. And we didn't quite understand how that exactly worked at the time, but those vaccines had to be pulled off. But most vaccines are pretty darn good. We've all essentially done it with polio because we've almost eliminated polio from the world. Same thing with smallpox, same thing with other things like measles and so on. Now, I know there are all kinds of arguments that we hear about, you know, vaccines not safe and so on, but that's a different, longer discussion. But so, you know, it may not be any more difficult to make a vaccine against the COVID than some others, but we don't know until we try.
Thanks.
Okay, Rob, are you good?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, so Greg, go ahead and unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Greg. You're muted.
There you go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Marshall, my question is very much related to what you just said. And what I would like to know is whether, either because you already got infected or you didn't get infected and got a vaccine, how long do you have to wait to know whether the antibodies that you create in your body will be active and neutralizing of further viruses? What is the technique to know? Does it take 10 years to figure out whether it works for 10 years, or how do you do it?
Okay, so there are several steps in developing. First, you produce a vaccine, you produce something that when you inoculate people, it produces the antibody, okay? The first thing you have to do is inoculate a small number of people to see if it's safe enough. In other words, they don't get seriously sick. Because we're not going to infect them with people with virus that's the same as the one now, you know, that causes disease. It's a different kind of procedure. But anyway, you inoculate people, you see if it's safe, okay? This could be a very small number of people. It could be 10, it could be 100. If it turns out that it doesn't make these people sick, then you can start inoculating larger number of people and see whether they develop enough antibody that might be the type that could protect people.
What is enough? What does that mean?
Enough antibody?
Yeah.
Well, detectable amounts, you know, and there are ways of detecting it. It's a kind of, these are relatively standard laboratory and vaccine production methods. You inoculate, and then after about 2 weeks or roughly 2 to 3 weeks, you draw blood from people and you measure how much antibody against the virus that they made. And if most of the people that are inoculated show production of antibody, you say, this is pretty good. Then you can start inoculating larger numbers. And you won't know if it's effective until you have some way of challenging those people with live virus, which most people wouldn't want to volunteer for, or you wait until the virus comes back in the community and you see whether those that were vaccinated aren't getting the disease. And that could take, you know, after the vaccine's developed and a bunch of people are inoculated and the epidemic comes back, that's how you know whether it worked. There's hardly any other way to really know.
So there is no real technique except waiting.
Yeah, pretty much.
Because as you said the other day when we discussed it, in the people who've already had the disease and they measured the antibodies, they didn't know whether these people were now immune or not.
That's true, because we haven't had an opportunity to reinfect those people either intentionally or if they go out and work, when they go out to work, if they don't come down with the disease, but everybody around them are coming down with the disease, then we'll know if they're immune or not.
That's very discouraging.
Well, but that's the case with almost almost every vaccine goes through this kind of thing. The problem is that this is such a devastating one that it makes you anxious to know that whether it's working or not.
But how come Ebola worked so much faster?
Well, it has a different dynamic. That's a matter of how it's able to do its infection. Now, just because each virus has its own way of infecting people and how many cells it can infect and the types of cells. And but Ebola, we isolated people quickly. But there are other coronaviruses like SARS and MERS that we isolated quickly, and also it wasn't as infectious. And so, different viruses within a virus group have different abilities, just like different hummingbirds feed at different kinds of flowers. They're all different.
But didn't you mention that for SARS, they did not find a vaccine for lack of time or interest or money?
It was mostly a lack of interest because it had already burned out. If it hadn't burned out, they had on the drawing board capability to do it, but there wasn't any monetary incentives to companies that do this because it would work. Now, we do not, got a different person here. Ellen, but anyway, it wasn't worthwhile because it burned out.
Okay, I'm going to mute myself. Thank you, Marshall.
Okay. Anyway, I don't know if we still, what the timing is and whether we ought to let Tony start and then we could come back to Q&A for both of us, or if there's one or two quick questions that somebody might have.
It's almost 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
I know my question is about herd immunity, and I don't know what Ellen has a question too. So will Tony handle herd immunity anyway, or?
I don't know whether he will or not, but basically herd immunity means that there are so many people in the population that are already immune that the virus can't get another foothold. But that takes, we have 350 million people in this country, and we have maybe a couple million infected. So there's still plenty of more people that can get infected. We have a long way to go for herd immunity.
Okay, and Ellen had a question. I was also wondering about Sweden, but we'll talk about that later. But Ellen has a question. Ellen, you want to unmute yourself?
Oh, I think it's a different Susie. Okay.
Yeah, so I hope, I was late to the meeting because I decided to go to that rally, but so I hope no one has already asked this question. But some people are allergic to colds, some of which are coronaviruses. So I'm wondering if when people have an antibody test, if the antibody test kind of shows a false immunity to the coronavirus. Do you know what I mean? Because some people do have antibodies to some coronaviruses.
Yeah, but but each virus causes the person to make different antibodies. So if you have antibodies, say, to the coronavirus that causes a cold, that antibody isn't necessarily going to protect you from any other coronavirus. They're all different.
No, but that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is if that shows up in the antibody test as an exposure to the coronavirus.
Oh yeah, but the tests are designed to be very specific for COVID-19 or COVID-6 or whatever. So they can be distinguished between in these tests if the test is set up right and if the FDA insists on proper data to show it and so on. And Tony is actually going to go into a little of that.
All right, thank you, Marshall.
Sure. Okay, anything else, or should Tony start?
Okay, Marshall, if we can have that last slide.
Okay, Diana, the next slide. There we go. That one.
Okay. I assume you all can see that.
Hey, Diana, can you make that a full screen here?
Okay, there you go. This is sort of our cartoon version of mismanagement. And I'm sure you recognize these characters. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, how to mismanage an epidemic. And the first thing I'd like to do, sort of the way Marshall did it, is to give you some definitions, and these will be, the beginning will be familiar to you, but there are two tests, and we just heard about both of them essentially. One is a test for the virus itself. It uses a methodology called RT-PCR, looking at the RNA virus to diagnose the actual presence of the virus. The other is a serology test for antibodies, and we've already spent in the question some time talking about what these do. It can be used to make the diagnosis, but it's going to be a late diagnosis. You cannot, in somebody who's symptomatic or just becoming symptomatic, use the antibody test for getting at the presence of coronavirus accurately. So let me also now explain a little bit about the regulation of tests. There are essentially two ways that tests for the coronavirus or many other things reach the market. The first is by manufacturers who manufacture a test kit and distribute it, either to laboratories or essentially to laboratories, and laboratories can make a kit and also distribute it to other laboratories. Since 1976, the FDA has the authority to rigorously regulate those tests. The manufacturers have to report data on the rate of false positives, the rate of false negatives, to make sure that the tests are really behaving the way we expect them to do in terms of making a diagnosis. The other way that tests become available that's not directly under FDA purview is in the laboratories, the clinical laboratories that offer the test. And here, the regulation is much more lax. It follows under the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, a law. The original CLIA law, CLIA, was passed in 1960. But since 1988, every laboratory that gives results, patient's results to a patient or his or her doctor, has to be licensed under CLIA, Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments. But licensing doesn't involve looking at the particular test itself. It involves looking at the quality of the laboratory. Do the personnel of the laboratory know what they're doing? Is the laboratory following good practices, et cetera, et cetera? But so far as the specific test, there's very seldom any effort to see that a laboratory is performing a particular test accurately and reliably. So those are the two ways: regulation of manufactured kits and clinical laboratories who can make the clinical laboratory and make its own test for COVID-19, for the virus, and doesn't have to get FDA approval if it's not going to make its test available to other laboratories. The third definition is contact tracing. I'm sure you probably all have a rough idea of what this is, but essentially it involves tracing the contacts of all new cases. A bona fide contact, and there are now several criteria for what is a bona fide contact, but bona fide contacts are then quarantined, isolated, and they're tested as well. And those contacts may be positive, and this I think is a point that needs great emphasis, that people who are asymptomatic without any symptoms whatsoever and remain asymptomatic can transmit the virus, even though they're asymptomatic. So that you can't be sure unless you start to test asymptomatic people, which was not done up and through the exponential phase in the United States. Unless you start to test asymptomatic people, you really don't know the extent of the virus. So that's why contact tracing, trace, isolate, test, and quarantine are essentially the steps in contact tracing. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk primarily on the early phase in the United States up to the beginning of March. Then we'll go into the middle phase and the late phase, and that essentially will be my talk. What should have been done? Now, China made the virus available, the sequence, the RNA sequence of the virus available in mid-January. And it was clear by then that China was sort of at the end of the exponential phase by that time. Knowing that, the first thing that the United States should have done was close its borders. Now, travel restrictions were announced on January 31st, but in the previous month, 300,000 people had come from China to the United States. So it's like closing the barn door after the horses are out. Already that disease from China was spreading. As Marshall reminded me this morning, the virus was also in Europe by that time, and travel restrictions from Europe were much less. So we're getting a two-pronged attack, and we were not prepared and did not effectively close the borders sufficiently to protect ourselves. So that's one. The second is testing suspicious cases for the virus. And that's how it started. I mean, were we looking at flu? Were we looking at something new, so-called the novel coronavirus, as it was called early on? And I said that in China, in the mid-January, had made the sequence of the test available worldwide. And within 3 days, the CDC had developed a test for the coronavirus, a diagnostic test using RT-PCR, and wanted to distribute it to health department laboratories to begin the testing on a large scale. This was at the very beginning of February. And instead of using FDA's standard operating procedure, which, as I said, involves fairly rigorous evaluation of the test, the FDA had to get the government had to issue what's called an emergency use authorization, EUA, and I'll be using that a lot. Now, under an EUA, and we'll talk more about this, the standards for showing that a test is safe and effective are much less. So under the EUA, which was issued to the CDC, even government agencies, if they want to market a test or distribute it, have to get some approval from FDA, either by standard operating procedure or by the EUA. But in early February, CDC started to distribute the test to health department laboratories. And they distributed to about 24 health department laboratories. Within a matter of days, 23 of those 24 laboratories discovered that the test was not operating properly. It was giving false positive results. 23 to 24, it's not a fluke. There was something wrong with the CDC test. That test, so far as I know, was never used on patients. The health department laboratories let the CDC know right away, and CDC withdrew that test. Interestingly, that was under an EUA. One wonders if there was a time, if the test had been offered under a standard operating procedure of the FDA, whether CDC would have been able to release that test because of its deficiencies. At any rate, this is a point at which we lost valuable time. And I want to spend a little time to point out to you that when in Marshall's slides of exponential rise, the beginning of March, the limiting factor there was not that necessarily was the beginning of the exponential phase, but the fact was that we did not have sufficient tests at that point to see if we were in an exponential phase. There just weren't enough tests. By the beginning of March, CDC had corrected the mistake, and health department laboratories, some of them had developed their own in-house tests. So this was a critical period, those 3 weeks at which we had insufficient testing capability let the virus explode essentially, and we really don't know if we had tested sufficiently when that exponential phase began. By Marshall's graph and many others, it's clear that by the beginning of March, the United States had entered the exponential phase of testing. That was the very beginning of March, where the graph started to shoot up. Sheltering was not ordered in the United States until March 16th, about 2 weeks after we had entered the exponential phase. And that was first in the Bay Area, including San Mateo County. And at that point, because of the scarcity of the test, and the test was essentially documenting that we were in a pandemic, exponential phase, that there was no contact tracing that was being done at all. We did not have the capability of it. And CDC, when it finally did get its act and the health department got their act together in the beginning of March, all that testing went into documenting that we were in the exponential phase without contact tracing. Now, the interesting thing is that countries that had been able to produce enough tests, to have enough person power to do contact tracing, and had ordered sheltering promptly, had controlled their epidemic. In fact, one part of the United States that I know is documented is in Washington State, where the first small epidemic broke out. And they realized this and undertook some degree of sheltering, some more testing, and were able to essentially flatten their curve in that area much more quickly than other parts of the country. But countries like South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, Iceland have undertaken much more rigorous use of those tools and have reduced their epidemics significantly. It was clear by the middle of March that we were in the exponential phase. And at that point, the big question was, how could we supply a number of tests in adequate numbers to keep up with the epidemic? And there are really two ways that this could have been done. The first way was under an act that was passed, I believe, originally in 1950, the Defense Production Act, in which the president could have ordered companies to cooperate with each other, develop tests, and give them the resources, the money that they needed to develop a sufficient number of tests. And actually, Trump did use that technique for ventilators. You remember when early in the epidemic, there was a fear that ventilators would be in short supply. And under the Defense Production Act, companies, including General Motors, for instance, were given funds by the government to develop ventilators. But that he did not do that for testing for the coronavirus, which I think was a big mistake. Many scientists had urged the government to use the Defense Production Act, and many nonprofit organizations, Public Citizen among them, had urged use of the Defense Production Act. I think the reason is clear. Instead, what President Trump, and particularly the FDA as his operating arm, did was to use the EUA, the Emergency Use Authorization. And on March 12th, the first company, Roche, got an EUA to provide the test. And by March 16th, commercial tests began to be distributed. Now, in issuing the EUA, FDA made it clear that companies did not have to even wait until the FDA had approved their EUA application before they could start to test people. In other words, there was no evidence when companies and laboratories started to test in mid-March that the test was any good. And in fact, in independent analyses done by outside groups, academic groups, it would turn out that one of the first tests that was used, a very rapid test by Abbott Laboratories, turned out to have a false negative rate of between 15 and 30%, depending on what study was being done. In other words, it was missing almost a third of the people, a quarter of the people who had the virus were being missed by that test. So the EUA, which has a long and interesting history, I don't think was the best way to develop tests in the United States. Even more importantly, those tests, when they did come out, were not used appropriately. And here I want to pause a little bit and look at the role of the media. So I'm sure you will all know, I know you're active in politics, that the front pages of our newspaper went from the Democratic primaries at the beginning of March to almost overnight be exclusively involved with the COVID-19. And Democratic primaries sort of dropped out of sight. I'm oversimplifying, but I think you get the picture. And in fact, it's interesting to show how rapidly things can be replaced, because until George Floyd's murder, COVID-19 did remain on the front pages of that paper, but now it's rapidly and appropriately except for the publicity given to the small number who were behaving inappropriately, been replaced by George Floyd's murder. And interesting to speculate why that had such an effect. Other murders, police brutality have not all resulted in this. It's interesting to wonder why at this particular time that happened, and we can speculate about that. In any event, this media, the media barrage about COVID-19 had some interesting effects, and I sort of call it a double-edged roll. I think some of those effects were helpful by scaring people about the spread of the virus, and were helpful probably increasing sheltering and therefore removing the number of people who could be exposed to the virus. For people who could shelter, they did. A more harmful effect was, I believe, an expanded and excessive demand for testing. People who were what have been called generally the worried well became very worried whether they had the virus or not. People with very minor symptoms were worried whether they had the virus. And you may recall that this demand for testing was so high that testing laboratories, commercial laboratories, as well as health department laboratories, had to restrict people to be tested who could not be tested if they did not have essentially severe symptoms of COVID-19. Now, interestingly, even among people with severe symptoms of COVID-19, testing was not really necessary. I mean, by this stage, we're in an exponential phase. It's sort of like a question, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So while some of those patients may have had influenza, they were essentially treated the same way, whether they had a positive test result or not. There was no specific treatment, still is no specific treatment for COVID-19, for the virus. And they were isolated and would have been isolated, quarantined, whether they had the disease or not. So not only we did finally, and by the mid-March, the FDA, the CDC and health department laboratories had sort of reached their capacity, and there was big explosion of commercial testing from that point on. But that testing did not involve tracing, did not involve contact tracing. And I believe essentially was used for the wrong purposes at that period of testing. So in addition to that, as I've said already, the tests under the EUAs were not perfectly valid. And sort of ironically, the second test that the CDC had developed when it was evaluated by independent laboratories was the best test in terms of the least false positives, the least false negatives of any of the tests compared to many commercial tests. So the government can get it right when it puts its mind to it and has the resources. So one bright side as we go through this epidemic from the exponential phase to where we are now is that global emissions of carbon dioxide fell by 17% between mid-March and mid-April. And that was something that could not have been accomplished virtually any other way in the preceding 20 years or so that we've been really worried about climate change. It's unfortunately, particularly as China has now gone back to opening up its economy, that the carbon dioxide emissions have stopped falling and are now only 13% of what they were compared to 17% early on in the epidemic. So now let me turn to the middle phase. And I define the middle phase as the leveling off of new cases in the United States and perhaps a small falling. But I have to remind you that at the end of May, there was still 20,000, over 20,000 new cases a day in the United States, which is the same as it was at the beginning of April. So despite this falling off, perhaps, we still had a lot of cases, and it means we still have a tremendous need for contact tracing, which is still not being done. Congress the president signed a bill at the end of April that provided $25 billion for health department laboratories and contact tracing. Right now, being held up in the Senate is a House bill for an additional $100 billion that really is needed to get states and local health departments to have the capability of contact tracing. So the last 3 months has seen what I call an enormous natural social experiment. I mean, we've learned how to work from home in many circumstances. We learned how to educate from home with the schools closed. And there maybe are bad aspects of that, but there certainly must be some good aspects of the use of technology in particular, to wonder whether they should not be retained. For instance, remote working from home, foregoing traffic jams and the expansion of office buildings at the expense of public housing or housing for people. There have been other things that have worked well. Telemedicine has particularly expanded. And people's response, Washington Post did a poll at the end of May, that with the exception of Republicans, a strong majority of Democrats and independents and people altogether favored controlling the spread rather than restarting the economy. And interestingly, among Black Americans, who are among the most hardest hit in the pandemic, 3/4 of them favor controlling the spread. And I guess that's because they know that they are particularly susceptible, least likely to be tested. There's some data the Washington Post this morning pointed out that early on in the epidemic that pretty obviously Blacks were not as able to get tests, although the tests were being done for the wrong reason, as were white Americans. It'll be interesting to see now after the Floyd murder, what happens as a result of people, as I guess Diana said early on, not practicing safe distancing in the demonstrations. And many jobs may never be regained, even when the coronavirus is no longer a threat, partially because they'll be replaced by other technologies. But I think new jobs can be created, and of course one that you're familiar with is the Green New Deal, and how much can be done to put Americans to work, improving the environment, ending our use of fossil fuels. Agriculture, there's an interesting article by Mike Pollan in the New York Review of Books this week that points out how agriculture, the monopolistic agricultural system in the United States, has just not been able to cope appropriately with the epidemic. Question of meat packers in particular, again here Latinos in particular, are victims of the way they have to work because there's no alternative way of getting meat out to people who need it. There are some interesting uses, but not on a large scale. So the last phase, where we really, and we're on the threshold of this now, and there still are arguments as to how much this should be used. Under what circumstances, I think we have to ask ourselves, individually and collectively, whether we're ready to return to work or even just socializing. And in terms of what might make it safe to return, I've got 4 points. One is if you've had confirmed disease, confirmed COVID-19 disease, that's probably the safest bet that you're not going to spread it to others, assuming that you're already healed. If you don't have a recent flu-like illness, if you don't have hypertension, if you don't have diabetes, if you don't have heart disease, if you're not obese, and if you're not elderly, it's a better bet that you can go out. But with those problems, I would still be very cautious. As I've said already, the coronavirus test result is not very helpful, the RT-PCR. It may be negative today, and you go out and you may be exposed tomorrow, and 5 days from now, you'll be infected and show symptoms of coronavirus. So the final way that's available now is antibody test results, and Marshall has spoken about this at some length, but it's clear to me, as it is to him, that right now, we don't know that antibodies provide protection against being reinfected. The people who have antibodies will have been infected once, but whether the antibodies will protect them and for how long that protection will last, we just don't know. I think it's pretty clear that with those problems, that there will be some sheltering that continues for many people for a long time. And for those who go back to work, the importance of safe distancing, if it can be done, difficult to do in meatpacking, for instance, and sanitizing, keeping surfaces clean, become particularly important. And of course, I'll say it again, I'm trying to say it so much, but we have to continue contact tracing and develop enough resources. Vaccine, people have talked about vaccine. There's an article in the Post this morning about countries competing for vaccines, which is not the way that it should be done. But there's a question of probably hoarding, and there are the major problems which Marshall has talked about safety and effectiveness of the vaccine. So that's where I'm at in terms of talking about the phases of the epidemic. I had a number of questions about the November election. The answers to my question, your guess is as good as mine. But just to throw it back into the political arena, here are some questions. Will the election be held? Will mail-in ballots be the law in all states? If not, will people come out to vote? And then there's the question of Biden's running mate, the vice president. Will the choice of the vice president affect the outcome of the election? If Trump loses, will he leave peacefully? And finally, will the Democrats control both the House and the Senate and use that for the major reforms, if not the revolutionary changes that we need to prevent this from happening again? I'm done.
Tony, thank you so much. We are running late, and I apologize. It's because of all the technical problems we had at the beginning. But I wonder if we can limit the questions maybe to just 3 questions. Susie, can you, I see that Greg Lowe has a question. Susie, can you check other people too? And let's start with Greg. Greg, unmute yourself and ask Tony a question.
Tony, I was a little bit surprised by how much you seem to have agreed with Trump on some of the things he said about testing. And if the CDC screwed up at the beginning, that was not completely his fault, although he had some indirect responsibility. But as far as the testing is concerned, you basically said the same thing as Trump said.
I hope not.
Well, you did.
No, I said, look, we spent all our testing essentially confirming disease. First limiting it to seriously ill people and then opening up a little bit to people who were worried about whether they had testing itself. That was still, all that testing capability was not enough to use testing the way it should have been used. At the best today, I think we're at sort of about 100,000 tests a day. What we estimate is needed for contact tracing is about 1 million. We need at least 10 times more testing that Trump has allowed. So I said I didn't think testing was used appropriately, but I vehemently disagree with Trump in how much testing we need.
Next question, Susie. I see Bill Newell has his hand up. Bill, go ahead.
Thank you. I heard Tony talk a little bit about whether people go back to work. My big question is, what if anything does he or Marshall or anyone have in terms of insight of what's going to happen with the schools? Because if the schools don't reopen, that has major impact on people's ability to go back to work unless you're working from home. And then there's huge implications as to, even if kids are asymptomatic, they can bring the virus back home if they go to school.
Well, there may be other people here that including Marshall, that can answer that question better than I can. In terms of many school systems, many that haven't announced what they're going to do in the fall. Many colleges, or some colleges that I know have said that they're not going to have face-to-face classes. That doesn't get to your question about parents being able to go back to work. But you're right, it's a major problem. And how well remote learning, my grandkids have been learning remotely, many of yours children have been learning remotely, how that's working out. What are they learning? How are they learning? Are there better aspects? Is it better in some cases than not? But that still leaves the problem of parents going back to work. And it raises a very difficult choice between controlling the spread and getting back to work and getting employed. And I think that we're in a very fortunate situation from where we are, and don't appreciate what a struggle it is. And that the fact that the stipend, what's it called, the $1,200 that people have been given, the unemployment benefits and the extension of the unemployment benefits are no substitute for work. So that's a real dilemma.
Elsa, I believe you had a question. Elsa Schaefer.
She still can't talk.
Elsa.
Okay, but this is Flavia, and she wrote her question here, and she wanted to ask Tony what he thinks of our adopting a single-payer universal healthcare system. He's an MD, and it would be interesting to hear his point of view.
I'm all for it. I think that the health system, it's been great, and people have pitched in, health professionals have pitched in to do more than we could have expected from them. But at the same time, I think you have to notice, and this is very interesting, that there are aspects of the health system that are misused. And I'm afraid many specialists have seen their livelihood go down the drains because people can't get to doctors through going to doctors' offices or clinics, et cetera, et cetera. One of the interesting things that's going to be revealed is that despite that, when you take out the deaths from coronavirus, is that people are not dying at a greater rate. They're dying at a lesser rate. And I think that one of the things that one might conclude from that is that maybe some of our use of medical technology, particularly for specialists, is not having much of an effect on life-saving problems. One of the biggest reasons that people go to see doctors is for return visits, and many of those are unnecessary. Now, I think if you had a single-payer system, it would be much more efficient and would be distributing healthcare much more equitably among the population and providing much more primary care and general care than focusing on specialists. As long as we continue to have an insurance-based system, and many doctors don't like that system because it's inefficient. Different insurance companies operate differently in terms of what they will cover and what they would not cover. So I'm very much, and have been for many years, in favor of single payer, and don't think that Obamacare, even with what's called a public option, is any substitute for Medicare for all.
Amen to that. And if we have time, the other piece of Elsa's question was, what percentage of false negatives does the CDC test have?
None.
Okay. Thank you. And Susie, you had a question?
Let me say one other thing about, I think, Greg, the CDC. You know, there's a real problem. CDC and FDA are both now political. The appointments Trump directly appoints the commissioner of FDA and the secretary of Health and Human Services, also a political appointment, appointed Robert Redfield as director of CDC. And they have both politicized the response of their agencies. Now, the agencies themselves for many years have built up through civil service a very effective operation. But unfortunately, many of their attempts, I believe, to curb their leaders have been unsuccessful. But I still have, and particularly FDA, which I know more about, has been in a constant battle, not only with the administration, but also with pharmaceutical companies who would much like to see much less regulation on the part of CDC. And I think the use of the emergency use authorization is a good example of how FDA is favoring commercial interests in dealing with this epidemic. I'm sorry.
I wanted to make a comment about an earlier question, if I could. The question was from Bill about what about school openings and things like that. And as Tony said in the beginning, it's a big social experiment because there are going to be some schools that'll open, some schools that won't, some geographic areas that will, some that won't, some that'll open stores, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to see for sure a resurgence of infections in some of those, and we're going to see a dampening of those in others, depending on those policies. And if I had to bet, the epidemiologists can easily predict which ones are going to be which.
Susie Ray.
Oh, I just had a quick question for Tony, asking about, I'm hearing about a lot of virus tracing apps, and I have real security issues, privacy issues about using a computer app to try and do some of the tracing. And I just kind of wanted to know if you had any input on that. Do you think that's a good way to handle the tracing? I just see it as another privacy dilemma.
Well, I do, and I'm glad you raised that because it's an important issue, and a lot of my ethicist friends have talked about privacy issues. The answer may be given to us because the use of cell phones turns out to be much less effective. Really means everybody's got to have a cell phone. And here again is a good example of how this testing discriminates, because who's going to have iPhones? African Americans are not going to have iPhones to the extent that white Americans have iPhones. But the point is that without blanketing the population, and we may think it is blanketed, but it's not very effective. But your point is well taken, and certainly it's not the test itself, but it's the amount of information. I mean, the reason cell phones work is because you can locate the people. So it would be a great help if everybody had cell phones and they were used for tracing. You could identify those people quickly. But at the same time, you're giving the cell phone manufacturers, and maybe ultimately the government, much more information other than the way to deal with the virus by opening it up. So it is a major privacy issue.
And it's who is getting that data and who gets to look at it.
Right.
That, and especially if you're looking at our current government, that's really rather a concern today.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Just one more question. Diana?
Yeah, Susie McKee. And Marshall, could you answer Rob's question in chat, please?
So I was just wondering more about, less about the test, which I wrote, but more about what's going on in Sweden, which is, I mean, because at some point we're going to have to reintegrate into society somehow. So, and they're just doing it a little sooner, so they're going to lose more people in the beginning. I just wondered what Tony thought about that whole idea of what they're doing, and I mean, this shelter in place was to keep from overloading the health system, and we've done that. So we're going to do like little waves of overloading it and unloading it, and because it will come back in the fall, I'm pretty sure. It's from everything I can figure out.
That was one reason for sheltering, preventing the overloading of the health systems. But I think the major reason for sheltering was to make less people susceptible to the virus by keeping them at home and without exposures. So it was not simply overwhelming the health system. That obviously was important. But I think the more fundamental question was the way of reducing the epidemic. And the question that I have, maybe Marshall can answer, is, we're not going to get up, and Marshall pointed out, we're nowhere close to herd immunity. But if we have people sheltering who have not been infected, what happens when we start to open up society? Again, most people will not have immunity. This is a novel virus. And will we go through second and third and fourth phases?
Well, what happens there is that we don't, if we dampen down or flatten the curve good enough by sheltering and other measures, then there's time for the development of a vaccine and treatment that would be effective. But that means a really prolonged period of sheltering in order for that to happen, because for a vaccine, it's going to be a year. For treatment, it might be quicker. I don't know, depending on how lucky we are.
Well, Marshall, the question I have for you is, if everybody's sheltered indefinitely, this is a hypothetical situation.
Yeah, right.
Could the COVID virus not have enough hosts, enough people that it could infect, that it would die out of its own?
Well, if we had really good sheltering, yeah. Because if one of the key components of the epidemic is how many individuals get infected by an infected person. And the more sheltering and lack of passage you have, the number of individuals that would be infected by an infected person could be below 1. In other words, if each individual could not infect more than one person, maybe only 1 in 2 would get infected, would be able to infect somebody, then you could actually end up with the virus going extinct, sort of. But there's always going to be what's called a reservoir of people that are infected. And so once you stop doing these measures, you could ramp up exponential growth again. So it's really a difficult thing to do. But maybe I should try to answer Rob's question, unless you have another point about that, Tony.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so Rob asked, what about viral loads and whether or not we need to worry about being exposed to very low viral loads, as might not be able to produce antibodies without producing significant disease. Well, the issue about viral load is how much virus do you get from an infected person? In other words, if they sneeze on you and give you millions of viruses, is that going to cause disease? And if they only, but you only talk to them and you only get 1 or 2. We do not know how much virus it takes to infect a person. But we do know from other kinds of viruses and laboratory experiments and so on, that different viruses can be infectious with different numbers. In other words, there are some highly infectious viruses that only take 1. And then there are other viruses that if a person or an animal or whatever aren't infected with lots, the chances that they'll come down with the disease is small. So, but we don't know the answer with COVID-19. And so we don't know. Plus, different people have different responses to viruses or anything else. Some people with a very little bit of infection will mount a really big antibody response, and some people don't. So it's a very difficult answer to give until you have data, and we don't have the data now because we haven't had enough time to get it.
Well, there is some data, Marshall, and I don't know how good it is. I haven't gone back to the sources. But for instance, people who remain asymptomatic, they've documented had positive cases, and apparently they are less capable of transmitting large loads of virus or large enough loads to seriously affect people. But that's, I don't know how good that data are.
And so there, in any population that's infected with anything, there's a broad variety of responses.
Absolutely.
And some people that are asymptomatic may not be shedding much. Some people that are asymptomatic may be shedding a lot, and just fortunate enough that whatever it is about their immune response or the number of cells infected, it's very, they remain asymptomatic. You know, it's right now we don't have a good idea. I don't, at least I don't.
And on that note of agreement, we're going to end the